and father and grandfather, but I actually forgot to ask you, Sandy, about those those members of your family. So feel free. You want to introduce what?
Sure. Jane and I have been married almost 44 years. And we have 4 children and 1 grandchild and 1 on the way. And the kids are scattered to the 4 winds. The youngest is 23 and is just about to start a master's program at American University. The oldest is finishing a PhD at Florida State University, and the other 2 are here and on. So kind of got them launched, although you never know if the launch is final or not these days, do you?
That's true, for sure. Well, today we will be exploring with Sandy what it can look like to live out God's way of harmony and his way of shalom on college campuses. And just to give you guys an orientation for our time, we'll spend the first 60 minutes or so interviewing him, although we will have a breakout section where we hope that you can introduce yourselves to one another and chat a little bit. Also, during that time, feel free to cheer Sandy in the chat or to ask questions. Brian Chang, who's Associate Director for Faculty Ministry, will be collecting any questions. And we will go from there. I do want to remind you all that we will be recording this. And so if you do not want to be recorded, please switch your Zoom to gallery view and take yourself off the screen. You can also take your name. So we're very glad you're here. And to start, Sandy, please share a little bit about your own story, a little about your faith journey and your leadership journey.
Well, it's not a real spectacular story in some ways, Kathy, but thanks for asking. I was, like many of the students I came to college, how should I describe myself then? Experimenting with a lot of things and finding them empty. And God got a hold of me about the middle of my freshman year, and through an InterVarsity small group led me to Christ. And those folks, mostly fellas and a few ladies that were friends then in Chapel Hill in the 1970s, are still lifelong friends, folks we're close with. And they discipled me and were very patient with me. And InterVarsity played a big role in those early years, still does through things like Ivy Press. I'm just immensely grateful for that. And we were nourished along the way. Jane and I met in InterVarsity and married about 15 minutes after she graduated. And I taught for a couple of years and then decided to pursue some questions that interest me in graduate school. And God has nourished us through some wonderful churches as we've moved around the country in my academic career. And still, those early friends from Chapel Hill, those early pioneers of InterVarsity there, are deep, close friends for us and spiritual partners, I guess. And I'm about as vanilla a Christian as you can imagine. Anglican, I guess, in orientation and style, and interested in a fairly middle-of-the-road Reformed theology about most things. I was trained mostly as a scientist and tend to see things through that lens a little bit. But there's nothing spectacular about me theologically at all. And Kathy, I guess I should transition to the leadership part of this story. So I didn't go to college to get a job. I had questions, and particularly in graduate school. And I went to graduate school because I was interested in epistemology. What makes truth true? How do truth claims make a difference and get established in the world? So I thought I was going to do philosophy, and I discovered that most of the philosophy taught at my university was political philosophy and not epistemology. So I instead pursued science, which had been my background, and thought I'll do a master's and doctorate maybe in the philosophy of science eventually. I was really interested in one philosopher in particular, a guy named Karl Popper. He's kind of eccentric. It didn't work out that way. I ended up with a PhD almost before I was ready for it, in teaching and learning the science of cognition. And God stumbled me through a series of things that gave me a job that was way over my head. I worked for a year or two as a scholar and an advisor at a thing called the North Carolina Board of Science and Technology, giving counsel to the state on science related issues, including economic development stuff. And out of that, I was hired at the tender age of 25 to be the chief academic officer of a system of 58 colleges with 800,000 students and $1 billion budgets and all that sort of stuff, and really had no idea what I was doing. The good news for me as a leader was that I knew that I didn't have the technical background and experience to lead on that basis, and that the only way I could legitimately lead in that environment was on the basis of principle. And so that's what I did. I prayed a lot, and I tried to be the guy in the room who said, let's stop arguing for a minute and let's agree on what it is we're trying to achieve. What's the underlying principle that we're trying to get flesh out here? And it turns out the people were hungry for principle-centered leadership, and that's the way I led the rest of my career. So I did that, as you said, for about 8 years, traveling all over especially all over North Carolina. I think I ate barbecue in every county, and there are 100 counties. Loved the work at a pretty high level, but really wanted more engagement with faculty and students because I loved them the best. And my job didn't afford much of that and was getting more and more political all the time. So I went to my boss and told him I'm going to have to find another place to work, and he helped me do that. And I ended up, as you said, first in Texas and then in Florida. Wonderful experiences in both cases. Along the way, Kathy, I discovered something important for me, and I won't go into this in detail, but just say that the project God gave me that's been my life's project wasn't especially about education, although I love it and was prepared for it and am passionate about it. But the project he gave me was more general than that. And the issue for me was, how do people thrive and fail to thrive in these enormous institutions that we've created in our societies? Higher education being one example, but healthcare is another. And as you know, I had a parallel career in healthcare for 20 or 30 years as a strategic leader for healthcare systems. But I noticed first in myself and then in others that people are easily deformed, twisted, confused, mixed up, sometimes turned diabolical at work. That our work forms us much more powerfully than we form it, and it can have environments that we work in, and the things we habitually do at work shape us so powerfully that we might wake up one day and look in the mirror and say, this isn't who I ever wanted to be. In fact, that happened to me, and I had to make some abrupt changes. So that's been the project for me in leadership, is how do we create institutional experiences, lives and environments and organizations and all that go with them, where people are nourished at the end of the day by their work instead of depleted, and where they feel like they've been on a journey instead of in a rat race, and where they maybe are enlarged by what they do and who they do it with rather than diminished. And so the experiment I've been engaged in now with particularly with 2 colleges, especially at Valencia, was trying to create that kind of an institutional experience, for the purpose of mission, but also for the purpose of the flourishing of the people who are delivering the mission.
Well, that leads us into the next question, because it sounds like Shalom was what you were trying to create at your university. But I wanted to hear what is your definition of Shalom? What do you think of when you think about Shalom? And then to follow up with that, where do you see the need for God's shalom most clearly on campus today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't suppose I ever sat down and tried to write a definition of shalom, but so let me take a crack at it. And I'm no theologian, as I said, I'm more of a chemist than anything else. But let me approach it two ways. One is sort of theoretically. Um, I think shalom, much more than just peace, has to do with living into our telos. That is, um, the whole counsel of God that's not just spoken, but spoken into being in the universe, the way we're made, the way the cosmos is made. And that shalom means living with the grain, the warp and woof of the way God made things and implanted telos and everything. In the 17th century, Richard Hooker wrote about that in terms of law. What he called law was really what he said law meant. God's law means oughtness, the way things ought to be. And we feel that oughtness when we have conscience, for example, or when we're flourishing. When you say, this is the work I was made to do, that's oughtness. And that's shalom for me. It's a combination of justice and righteousness and truth and peace, peace that flows from the fact that you are being true to the nature God created that we marred, that he's restoring, both in us and in all the rest of creation. So that's one way to think about it. That's a theological conversation. But practically, for me, it's always been about Psalm 84. And I have read this psalm thousands of times in hard times and good times. It's been the touchstone for almost all of my work. And it's the answer I always give to students when they say, I'm trying to figure out my calling. How do I find my vocation? So you know Psalm 84, and you know that it's got this wonderful opening bit that's really kind of a song of pilgrimage going to the dwelling place of God. You know, how lovely is your dwelling place? And we love that. We've turned it into songs, and this image of the pilgrim arriving at the great temple and never wanting to leave and being jealous of the birds that get to nest in the nooks and crannies all around the temple walls because they get to be in the house of the Lord day in and day out forever. And then the end of it we know because it has that wonderful promise about God not withholding anything from those who walk uprightly. We like to quote that as a promise verse. The middle of it's rarely quoted, but the middle of that psalm says, "Blessed is the one whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the pilgrim's highways. Though he pass through the valley of desolation, he will make it a place of springs. Yes, the early rains will fill its pools with water. They will go from strength to strength, and the God of gods shall be their vision in Zion." This idea of bringing shalom to me invokes that psalm, Kathy, that all of our callings, what God empowers us to do is to go into the valley of desolation and make it a place of springs. Now, not every place seems like a valley of desolation, although in higher education, it seems not that uncommon for people to experience their work that way. Their department might be toxic. Their institution may have toxic leadership. Their board might be crazy. They may be in deep enrollment or financial crisis. Their legitimacy might be challenged, or they may be completely caught up in the whirlwind of tenure chasing and grant and contract chasing and all that sort of stuff. It can be a desolate place at times, and an isolating place. People walk the valley of Baca mostly alone. And I think we're all called, certainly our leaders are called, I felt called, to look for the places at my institutions that were valleys of Baca and see what it would take to bring life-giving springs, to make them nourishing valleys of, rest and refreshment and growth and maturity and fruitfulness and all those sorts of things. So to me, shalom speaks to that. It's how do you turn this desolate valley into a place that's fruitful and refreshing, and where we all flourish instead of compete and hurt and starve and all the other things that we do.
And was that your answer also for where we need it the most on campus?
Well, that's very different from campus to campus, I think. Um, for and depending on your role, you look at it differently. Again, we all have these tools that we use every day and the roles that we inhabit that are sort of given to us. And unless we're really wholly subversive, we sort of live in those roles without challenging them too much. But and there's some value in the traditions associated with them. But I want to talk about being subversive later. So I had a different role than, say, a faculty member, but I wanted to be a brother to the faculty, because nothing I did accomplished the mission. Only their work did. My job was to create the conditions where they could do their very best work and to make sure that we agreed on what that looked like. That is, what are the outcomes we're seeking together, and challenge inside the institution the systems and the processes, what the Bible calls the powers and principalities that drive day-to-day living and the long-term outcomes. So for me, bringing Shalom started with trying to understand the community of work I was in, how well we were achieving our mission, why that mission should matter to anyone, using evidence and other sorts of things, listening deeply, trying to understand everybody's story, and beginning to build a kind of a public square where we practiced shalom while we rebuilt the institution. That shalom has to be in the process, not just at the outcome. So it doesn't come after you've done something. You do shalom, and it flourishes with you. It creates an environment where you can flourish. And so habits of things like serious listening, deep collaboration on work, really courageous conversations about how we're performing and why we perform the way we do, challenging the deep architecture of the institution, the things that incent and disincent, and the things that build people up and tear them down, all the unintended and often pernicious consequences of those systems have to be challenged. That's the kind of work that you do to, in Robert Greenleaf's language, to redeem servant institutions. And I should say, Greenleaf was a great help to me early in my career and has been a touchstone ever since. I'm sure you've read him. Everyone uses the phrase servant leadership, and he coined it, of course. And if you haven't read his work, his seminal book was written in 1970. It was fashioned out of letters that he'd been writing after he retired to lots and lots of folks in institutional life. And he sort of fleshed out this idea of the servant leader. We're so enamored of leaders and we lionize them that we missed much of his point, because the character of the servant leader is important. But he also wrote about the mission of servant leadership and the character of servant institutions, and those get overlooked a bit. So I think what I learned from Greenleaf is that all our institutions, well, first let me say that our institutions are amazing, that we should celebrate them because they may be the most important technology of the last 200-300 years. 200 years ago, if you weren't very, very privileged, you didn't learn to read and write. If you were not male, you're not likely to learn to read and write. If you weren't Caucasian, you weren't likely to have those privileges. If you got the measles, you died. And one of the things that's happened over the past century and a half, especially, is that we built these huge, enormous, complex, multi-layered bureaucracies that we call institutions in order to extend to the masses things that were only available to the privileged, the most privileged before. They're imperfect, but wow, look at what they do. They distribute food. These are for-profit and not-for-profit institutions. We have near universal education. We have massive access to health care. We have really good fresh food available to most people most of the time in our developed societies. They should be celebrated. But these same institutions that are wonderful are also awful. They often destroy the people that work in them. They may even damage the people they were designed to serve. And Greenleaf would say that organizations are like organisms. Over time, they behave in ways that are self-serving for their survival, even at the expense of their mission. And that the mission of the servant leader, the sort of Philippians 2 selfless leader, isn't just to be a humble person, but to walk into danger, into the dangerous places in our institutions, and challenge them, recall them to their servant ethic. You sort of step in front of a freight train sometimes when you do that and get run over. And that's the subversive element. So a good bit of my career has been praying through and trying to figure out how to be that person and to encourage others to be that person in our institutions, so that they were true to their calling of servanthood. The institution is true to it. And our institutions serve our students, and they serve our faculty and staff, and they serve our larger society in important ways. And reaching some kind of general agreement on those purposes is really important for the health of the work community. So again, Robert Greenleaf was really helpful to me. He was not a good writer, so his books are turgid and kind of difficult at times, but the content is spectacular, and so I recommend them. There's
Good.
even a Greenleaf Center, I think there used to be, in Indianapolis, that continues to publish work in the area of servant leadership.
Well, Sandy, you've given us a lot to think about and react with. And so we are going to send folks into small groups of about 3. And in your groups, we invite you to share your name, your campus, field of study, if you're a professor, and to answer the question, where do you see the need for God's shalom most on campus today? So you'll have about 10 minutes. So do your introductions, and then you'll have 10 minutes to discuss. And then we'll come back and we'll ask Sandy more questions. We'll continue the interview with Sandy now. And again, feel free to throw in questions or comments or cheer him on. Would love for this to be interactive. So Sandy, you did speak a little bit about what shalom-bearing leadership looks like. Wonder if you had some thoughts about shalom-bearing teaching or research.
So we're talking about the faculty role in particular here, and you and I've had this conversation before, so let me share a little bit about this by way of background. When I'm in deep conversation with faculty, particularly Christian faculty, believing faculty, but really with all faculty, I'll often ask them a question like this and say, how do you understand your stewardship of your students? And how do you understand your stewardship of your discipline? And how do you understand and practice your stewardship of your colleagues, especially your department? And how do you understand your stewardship of your institution, because all four of those are important dimensions. And at different points in your career, you're focused on different parts of that. But those are the four questions that I think as a teacher, I would try to keep in front of myself. How do I love my students as a scholar, teacher, guide, coach, all the other things you might describe yourself as a teacher, an architect of learning environments, whatever. How am I caring for my students? How am I caring for my discipline? What do I, as a believer in Jesus Christ, bring to the conversations in my discipline? And third, again, how do I love, care for, support, sustain, create shalom with my colleagues? That's often the hardest one because people are at the institution for a wide variety of reasons. Sociologists call universities in particular what's refractory organizations, meaning that they are kind of held in this dynamic tension of competing interests, sometimes competing terrors, but sort of a tension where people aren't really on the same wavelength, but they've negotiated an uneasy truth about here's what I need to get from the institution. I'll give you this for the institution if I get this back, and so on. So in all of those areas, Kathy, I would go back to the first question, and it's the question of teleology. What's the telos? What's my purpose here? My purpose, God-given purpose with students. What's my God-given purpose in my discipline, in my research or scholarship? What's my God-given purpose? How's God calling me with purpose to my colleagues? And if you're in an institution, I think you have to ask that question at the institutional level too. What's my telos, my purpose here at the institution for making shalom, for making this a place of flourishing? And I don't think you can answer that for another person. I think they have to wrestle through that because the imprint that God makes on our lives through telos, through purpose, is unique to each person. But I would say that God almost never calls us to be part of an unhealthy environment, to be one who creates an unhealthy environment, who creates the crucible for other people, who makes the world toxic and difficult and so on. He's calling us to make the valley of Baca, of desolation, into a place of springs. So how do you pray for your students that they'll be refreshed? How does your teaching, the way you practice your office hours, your accessibility to learners, whatever the modality might be, your willingness to engage things beyond the strict curriculum, your understanding of the life circumstances that they might be in, and having clarity about what the difference is between rigor and just being mean. Those are issues that everybody wrestles with together. And by the way, it's so much better wrestled with in community together with others. So as a Christian faculty member, having other believers that you can connect with on campus for prayer for the students, for those conversations about how did you handle this? Did I handle this the right way? Is there another way to handle it? Or how can we serve our colleague who's clearly in distress? Or being in Christian community in the context of the institution helps a ton. I guess lastly, I'd say that there's no future in isolation. That everything God's doing is aiming at intimacy. Everything he does in the world is reconciliation. And there's a reconciling ministry in every institution, whether it's higher education or healthcare, or whatever it may be. And so it's sometimes helpful in those domains of our work to ask the question, where's reconciliation needed here? Where can I be an ambassador for Christ? reconciling people to God and to one another and to the human community. So there aren't easy answers. Those are things you wrestle with. I can tell you that as a young president, I prayed most frequently and most fervently for the spirit of the place, not for the finances, not for the politics, not for the personnel, not for the accolades and outcomes, not for the budget. Um, I felt in my role that if the spirit, the heart of the place was right, this was a place of deep hospitality. If this was a place where people um, felt they belonged, whether they're a faculty member, student, or whatever, I belong here. And I have voice and can flourish here. If that existed, that spirit existed, everything else gets easier.
So, can you tell us some stories of how you helped bring that spirit to your campus?
Yeah. So, so Valencia was a good college when I arrived in January of 2000. It had a culture that I would describe as um, heavily influenced uh, by financial matters, really stewardship of resources, which is to say, the line culture of the place was enrollment's good, spending is bad. So, so they really the leadership of the organization was managing the balance sheet, and this worried me. I knew this coming in that it was pretty much that way. It's that way at lots and lots of colleges and universities, especially when they're under distress. But there was this skunk works, this fringe culture that I discovered in the process of checking the college out, of faculty and staff. It's a big place, so this is maybe 100 people, but that's a small group at an institution as large as Valencia. About 100 people who are in this deep conversation about the things that really matter, like, is this the best our students can do? And how can we serve them better? And what about the students who come to us sort of as refugees from other places and with limited preparation and with school histories that are not particularly good and so on? They were asking all the right questions, and they were beginning to get to the right theory of practice, which is anyone can learn. Most of higher education is still stuck in a manufacturing model that says, send me better raw material and I'll produce a better product. And these folks are saying, no, 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 these are human beings. And most of them have the capacity to learn just about anything we have to teach if the conditions are right. And so the first thing I knew I had to do, Kathy, was to challenge the prevailing anthropology and sense of mission in the line culture, the central culture, and substitute for it this fringe culture, to bring that fringe culture into the center. We called it learning centered at the time. We said, look, the college's mission is to cause learning to occur. And that's going to be our touchstone for everything, for every student. How do we know they've learned anything? And is this the best they can do? And how can we change the conditions of learning that will improve things for them? So it's deep mission work, but it's also, technically demanding. So that led to all sorts of things. Once you begin to shift the culture in that direction, then people are looking to see, so, are you spending money that tells me you care about learning? Are your priorities for the budget about learning? Are you, who are you hiring and who are you promoting? And how are you supporting your faculty so that they can do their very best work? And are all these things that the institution has done historically just to generate money or enrollments that we know are bad for learning? Are we going to keep doing those things, or are we going to stop doing those things? So that's what I mean by deep architecture. We started to redesign everything around this principle that we believe nearly every student can learn what we have to teach if we find a way to create the right conditions. We had a period of time where we just had meeting after meeting after meeting to answer one question. And the question was, what are the 10 dumbest things we do? And by dumbest, we meant things that we know aren't good for our students' learning, but we do them anyway. And we do them for budget reasons or enrollment reasons or some other, legacy reason. What are those things? And we made list after list after list. And then we started to focus on the ones that really were systemic and said, can't we design the institution, redesign it to get rid of all those stupid things that we do? And so we did. And we changed many, many things, things that touch faculty, things that touch schedules, curriculum, everything. And our results improved dramatically. Our students' results improved dramatically. So there's that kind of work, that's systemic work. That's what I do now, is coach other presidents. I'm a senior fellow with the Aspen Institute, and I coach other presidents, young presidents, on transformational work in their institution by redesigning the deep architecture of the institution, the reward systems and all those other things that seem untouchable, that actually become diabolical over time rather than mission centered. And then at the other end of the spectrum, sometimes you just do things that are kind. You do all the good. What's the Wesley's comment? Do all the good you can to all the people you can in all the ways you can in all the places you can for as long as you can, or something like that. That's that recognizing if this is somebody's Baka, somebody's valley of desolation, what can I do to make that better? And that ranged from knowing how to bend rules and break them sometimes, how to treat people as persons and not instances, teaching HR that policy serves human beings, not the other way around, dealing with all sorts of issues, sometimes controversial issues. I remember very early in my years, in 2002 or 3, in this very conservative southern town of Orlando, being among the first in the region of the employers to provide domestic partner benefits, for which I got beat up a little bit. And I can remember a group coming to my office, and I knew everybody in the group, and they knew I was a Christian and said, "How could you do this?" And I said, "Look, I'm not making a statement on marriage. I'm just trying to take care of my people. And so you tell me how you want me to treat your daughter if she works for Valencia and comes to you someday and says, I think I'm a lesbian and I have a partner now. You want me to treat her badly at work because of that? Is that what you want? No. She's got her own valleys to walk through. I want to make work not be one of those for her." So, it's across the spectrum, but you're tuning yourself in your role to say, I'm going to be aware when other people are in these valleys of desolation, when they're being harmed by coming to work, and I'm going to do what I know how to do to make work, again, nourishing and enlarging rather than depleting and diminishing.
You alluded to this, but I wonder, what were the challenges? It sounds like you can't do deep architecture without having opposition. So the
Yeah,
challenges to bringing shalom.
yeah, that's a good point. So the first challenge is that people don't believe you. Whatever your reform may be, whatever your agenda may be, we've trained people to be pretty skeptical because these things come and go so fast. Leaders come and go so fast. Most presidents, at least from the outside, look like they're pursuing their careers, not the flourishing of their institution and its mission. Sometimes the assumptions of business life in America and all of the broken anthropologies associated with that find their way into higher education, and the management mindset drives leadership, and people have been burned by that so many times they just don't want to believe you. So you have to earn trust, and I think we did that initially and on an ongoing basis by going first. You go first. Change is hard. I'll go first. So taking risks for the sake of others and for the sake of the mission with things like our money and our time and our reputation. Part of it is going into the very places where you assume you're not going to be welcome and loving the people there. They may never agree with you, but you can still have a relationship with them. And over time, most of those who were fearful or sort of intransigent or predisposed to believe this was a scam or a manipulation or wasn't real or whatever, or that when they were invited to have voice and given trust to work things out, most of them came over. It's the same way you would want to be treated. So, for example, we redesigned faculty compensation top to bottom, and it was not controversial because we had a discipline of collaboration that put everybody in the room to figure this out together on the basis of principles. And it takes a discipline. Collaboration is a design discipline. We had to practice it for a while. And I think a lot of leaders, Kathy, have this thing backwards. They think that what our institutions need are leaders we can trust. And that's true. We need leaders we can trust. But just as much as we need leaders who trust us, who invite us into the work and trust us with things. And we redesigned how you earn tenure. It got much tougher, as a matter of fact. The faculty did it. I trusted them with that work. It was a trust and verify kind of deal where we had to agree at each stage of the work, are we in principle on the same wavelength? But they did the work, and it was remarkable. It changed everything. So I don't have a formula. I don't have an easy answer, but I would say the institution itself has a life. The department has a life. The institution has a life that's sort of larger than just the individual lives in it. So first and foremost, give attention to the persons around you, your students, your colleagues, and so on. Do that. That's first. But second, start asking questions about the character of the institution itself and where you can make a difference there. I've wondered for a long time whether, for example, there's such a thing as institutional fruit of the Spirit. Sort of Galatians 5, was that 5:20 or 5:22? Could you look at an institution and see those things? What are they? Love, joy, peace, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control, whatever. Do you see those things in the work community, in the institution's life? And if not, then pray for them and practice them and encourage others to practice them together. I don't know that there's a technology for doing that. I think it starts with prayer.
Well, I promised that we would have Q&A time, so we're going to turn to some. I see a question that Diane asked in the chat. She says, Sandy, many are speaking of the reduced enrollment and reduced budgets at colleges and universities. Where and how do you see this impacting ministry on campuses in 5 years or in the future?
That's a good question. So I don't think that the scale is an issue very much. I mean, we've lost about 11% of the enrollment nationwide since 2010 or 11, if I'm counting correctly. So in scale, we're about where we were in 2006, and ministry functioned just fine there. What has changed is modality, the way people experience institutional life, both students and faculty and staff. Um, at my former institution, there are no IT staff on campus. They all work from home. There are nobody in accounts receivable goes to the office. They work from home. About 65% of the instruction still is either hybrid or online, and the students just aren't as present in the same way on campus. Everything that we have provided historically that's been effective for us face to face has to have some kind of a digital analog now. That's a funny phrase, digital analog. It has to have a way of being delivered digitally. That to me raises lots of questions about the model of ministry. But they were being raised already, if you think about it. Commuter students, students in non-traditional institutions, students who work full-time and more, students of various ages, students who are first gen, students who have a very heavy dose of imposter syndrome. All these things have become very common in higher education. And our models of ministry, particularly in InterVarsity, have historically sort of grown from a core of very traditional students on very traditional campuses, very traditional faculty on very traditional campuses. And then we tried to stretch to meet the needs of those that we recognize don't fit that pattern very well. And I'm not sure that the wineskin can stretch that far. So one of the things we'll have to do is invent, I think, parallel models of ministry. In many cases, I think the focus is going to move from direct discipleship of student leaders who then in turn disciple other students to focus more on faculty. The most influential persons in the student's life in this new modality are the people they actually engage with every day. And that's the faculty, maybe their academic advisor, and a couple of other kinds of people like that. I think faculty have much more potential influence on the trajectory of their students' well-being and their faith than they've ever had before. Partly because students are asking the questions in a different way, and partly because what you say in an email exchange with a student is not the same as what you might have said in a lecture hall with 200 other sets of eyes on you. It's just a new world. So I think, again, it's not scale. It's the diversity of ways in which higher education is being pursued now and delivered that will challenge ministry.
Thank you. So Cynthia asked, what part of Valencia's character, spirit, practices became widely known? At my own community college, the answer to any challenge was often to look at Valencia.
Well, that's flattering, and thanks for saying that. We had, when I looked at Valencia, mostly I saw warts, just like I see when I look at myself in the mirror. So I knew all of our failures and warts. We did have some success, and we learned some things that were useful. The spirit of the place really was transformational. So trust grew to a really high level in the organization, and we could try stuff, and it didn't scare people, and we were willing to do things at scale. So most colleges are they're really an umbrella organization for 1,000 little small businesses. Every faculty member is almost like a craft worker in their own little business. Every department's a little separated from the others, and there's just not cohesion and direction. And we were able in our work to focus on a few things that matter to everybody and get those things done, like student outcomes, particularly student outcomes with equity. looking at students who had been overlooked. Now, I have to say, this was a community college. It's the place I chose to work because I love the underdog, and I've always loved the underdog, and that's who I want to be hanging out with. I was offered jobs at other kinds of institutions, and I've probably been unkind and unjust in some of my judgments of them. So the mission and the way you think about that in an R1 or in an elite private independent or something like that might be a little bit different. But in every kind of institution, you can ask this question. And some of you have heard me say this before. Every pedagogy implies an anthropology. What's yours? What you're doing every day as a teacher is built on a set of assumptions about what it means to be human, what it means to be a human adult, what it means to be a human adult learner. And most of us don't stop to examine those things. And so if you haven't thought deeply about those things, then chances are your best efforts at good practice are actually just knocking off other people's practices. Well, I can create a list for that, just like they have at Jiffy Lube. Anybody here really want to be a Jiffy Lube tech in the classroom? Or do you want to be a complete professional? So the beginning of professionalism as a faculty member is to have an examined anthropology. What do I believe about my students? Is talent rare or common? Are there really people who just can't do math? Is that 70% of Americans can't do math? That's what they believe about themselves. Who belongs here and who doesn't belong here? And whose literature is valuable and whose isn't? And there's 1,000 questions like that you can ask that get to the root of it. You can ask the same question, by the way, about almost anything else, because every tenure system, every employee evaluation model, every compensation model in business implies an anthropology. And we have swallowed, accepted an unexamined anthropology in almost all of those areas, and it's not biblical. I pray that believing professionals, especially in my profession, will think deeply and achieve what I would just call a sacred anthropology, an anthropology that aligns to what God has to say it means to be human. And then build our practices around that. You won't have shalom until our systems and practices, the powers and principalities of the world, are designed around a sacred anthropology.
I have a question then. What is the anthropology that you see most commonly on campus in contrast to the gospel anthropology?
Yeah. So there are multiple competing ones. A book that helped me a lot to think about this was by a sociologist named Christian Smith. Now, Christian, if he hasn't retired, he was at Notre Dame last time I looked, but I met him when he was in Chapel Hill. He wrote a book called Moral Believing Animals. And his essential argument to the sociology profession was we're stuck in our profession and our discipline because our anthropologies are inappropriate and inadequate. There are two competing essential anthropologies in the social sciences. One is Homo economicus, that human beings are essentially all optimizing their economic position all the time. It's sort of the last remnants of Marxism are in Homo economicus. And by the way, it's practiced also in hyper-capitalism. So the circles sort of come around and they've met themselves coming back. The other one is Homo determinus, that there really isn't any choice and agency. It's all just an illusion that human behavior is predictable because it's determined. And that's the quantitative side of sociology, for example. And Christian says, none of us live like those things are true. Maybe they're not so true. Maybe we need a richer anthropology. And towards arguing for that, he said, here are at least two things we know about human beings. that our anthropologies don't include. One is that all human beings live in a thickly webbed moral environment. A thickly webbed moral environment. They're deeply interested with justification. They may not agree on the morals themselves, but hardly anybody is amoral, and no societies are. They just have a different morality. And by the way, they're not as different as you might think. So the anthropology in explaining social behavior in sociology, for example, has to account for that fact that these are moral animals of some kind. Where does that come from? Why do they think this way? Is that a product of evolution? Is that a product of something else? Where does that come from? And then the second, he said, is that in almost every culture, in almost every time, there has been a recognition of the transcendent, believing animals, animals that believe in something larger than themselves. The character of those beliefs are different, shapes and so on, but it's very hard to find a human society that doesn't have gods. And he says, we ought to be thinking about that and how that determines human behavior and so on. Well, those are two little examples. For our work, I think what I find is that people revert to sort of transactional anthropologies. So the student is a customer. That's the most common one. The student's a customer. They're buying something. They want a commodity from the institution. I'm here to provide that commodity, I guess. I don't know. Before that, and sort of layered with that, is the notion of the student as raw material. They come in, a lumpless shape of clay. What's that phrase in the paper chase? You come in here with a skull full of mush, and I teach you to think like a lawyer. That was Professor Kingsfield in that classic film. The students are raw material. If they get through this assembly process, one person at a time does something to them, and at the end of this, they get a degree and they're a product. You hear this in the language of talent pipeline. I hate that phrase, and I hear it all the time. I'm always stopping meetings in places like DC because somebody's talking about the talent pipeline. I said, to begin with, these are not units of talent. These are human beings, and you can't figure out why they don't want to work for you because you've been treating them as units of talent, and they're tired of it, and they want to be treated as persons. And until you do, you can't create a compensation system that will hire them and hold them because they're sick and tired of it. So there's customer, there's raw material, there's worse, there's in the old practice of higher education is a sort of apprentice professor. So if you go to if you work in an independent college with a strong liberal arts curriculum, sometimes the impression is let's pay attention to the ones who might replace us, who really love what we're doing. Why don't they love the college the way we do? Why don't they want to hang around and so on? In the urban environment, our biases come into these, and you'll find that even Christians have profoundly broken anthropologies of people who are not like them. And they don't even know it. They don't know it. But the learners know. And it comes out in their performance. And the excruciating and deeply rewarding work of wrestling your own unexpressed, unrecognized biases out of your classroom is worth doing. Both for the students' learning outcomes, but also for you as a human being who needs to flourish in complete community, not just oblique community. So those are some examples, and probably others on the line would have other anthropologies they've seen that don't work very well.
Well, we have one more question from Eric. Sandy, you've mentioned powers and principalities multiple times that shape the systems of institutions. What resources have you found most enlightening or helpful on this topic?
Yeah. So I'm using that language in a different way maybe than St. Paul used it. He wrote about the heavenly places. I don't think I would call even Valencia a heavenly place. But I think there is an older tradition, a medieval tradition, really, and an post-Enlightenment tradition among Puritans, to think of those heavenly powers having earthly expression in the things that we make and do and build, uh, like the social systems that we've created in society that oppress people, or that sometimes oppress and sometimes don't oppress. So what I'm arguing for is to become really savvy about how institutions are actually bundles of systems, and that if you want to change the institution, you have to rewire the systems. The deep DNA of the institution is hardwired in to the business model, the revenue model, the way we think about mission, who we serve, how we serve them. Just try to change something simple, and you'll see how hardwired it is. Years ago, I was on my first visit to Oxford as a visiting scholar. I was talking to the head librarian who was just retiring, and he was kind of a historian of the institution. And we were there during one of the interterms. So the schedule of classes at Oxford and Cambridge is like this. Beginning around the end of September or beginning of October, you have classes for 8 weeks, and then you have a break for 6 weeks. And then you have another 8-week term, a Michaelmas term in early spring, and then you have another break for 6 weeks. And then you have this sort of leaned down summer term of 8 weeks, and then break all the way to October, which is like 10 weeks, 12 weeks. And I said, this is crazy. You've got all this dormitories and all this laboratory, all this physical plant empty for 6 weeks between these. How did this happen? He said, well, when the place was founded in the 15th century, it was assumed that the longest a group of young men could live together without a bath was about 8 weeks. And it took 2 weeks for them, most of them, to get home on horseback or in a carriage. And then they had 2 weeks at home, and it took 2 weeks to get back here. So the breaks were 6 weeks. So it's a medieval tradition that we still honor here. I said, why do you honor the tradition? And he looked at me right in the eyes and said, because the fastest way for a chancellor to get fired is to decide to change the academic calendar. It's these little things that are hardwired, the way the budget works, the way faculty workloads are assigned, the way we contract for labor, the way we earn our revenue. Those are the things that are sort of the skeletal and muscular composition of the body of the institution. And we think we're going to fix that by changing the makeup. You know, a little powder, a little rouge, not going to work. So if you're serious about as a leader, if you're serious about the shalom of the institution, the long-term flourishing of the institution, meaning the flourishing of its mission and its capacity to deliver that mission, then you have to go deep into the institutional reform business. And it takes a lot of savvy about how organizations really work.
Thank you. Well, we have around 12 more minutes. So what I think I'm going to do is I want to make a couple announcements, and then I would like to send folks back into breakout groups so that you can process, and then you can be excused from your breakout group. The announcements.
And Kathy, I'll stay right here, Kathy, in case somebody wants to linger behind and chat for a minute.
Great, that will be awesome.
Okay.
So just a couple announcements. As I said at the beginning, we're in a faculty summer series. Next week, Tuesday, we will be having another webinar on the anxiety opportunity with Curtis Chang, who just wrote this book, where his challenge is how do we look at anxiety as an opportunity as opposed to only seeing it as a problem and a mental illness. And we have another set of prayer meetings on Friday at 8 and 12. So if you would like to join us, just drop on in. And we also want to point out that there will be a workshop on sharing our scholarship in August with Dr. Marilyn Raphael, hosted by our Black Scholars and Professionals Ministry. So with that being said, we'd love for you to think about joining this fall in the Harmony Way. Partly, this was a teaser, this faculty series. For those who've been around, we've had a summer pilgrimage that didn't happen this summer because it wasn't ready. So the Harmony Way is based on what we can learn from our Native American brothers and sisters and the experience of pilgrimage here in this country. So we invite you to think of joining that this fall, and we will send out more email and invitations about that. So with that being said, invite you to go into your breakout groups